Thank you for taking the time to watch this video on ethics. I wanted to spend a couple minutes with you sharing with you my thoughts on why I think ethical behavior is so important and why we as a department are emphasizing it. The public rightfully expects that public servants like DOT employees demonstrate the highest of ethical behavior as we go about performing our day-to-day job responsibilities. And the department is very committed to making sure that all of our employees not only meet but exceed the standard expected of us by the public. The department is committed to ensuring that all employees in the department meet the public's expectations in terms of ethical behavior. We feel so strongly about this that we've incorporated that expectation into our core values, which require and expect that all employees demonstrate respect, integrity, professionalism, honesty when it comes to dealing with their coworkers, our internal customers, our partners, stakeholders, and the public as we go about our day-to-day jobs. Ensuring ethical behavior from all employees can be especially challenging in a large department like DOT, where we have many people who work independently or remotely. Many positions have decision-making opportunity that provide many opportunities for unethical behavior. That's why it's so important that all of our employees demonstrate a high level of ethical behavior in order to help build the level of trust required to be successful and excel in their position. There are many state laws and department policies that provide guidance on how to engage in ethical behavior, but these laws and policies cannot possibly cover every situation. And the determination of what is ethical in a particular situation or what is right or what is wrong should really not fall on the question of, am I going to get caught or is anybody looking? Each of us is a representative of the department when we go about doing our day-to-day jobs and even how we conduct ourselves outside of the workday. Making bad decisions or engaging in unethical behavior reflects poorly on the department as a whole and can negatively impact the public's trust of the department and its many hardworking employees. Each of us has a personal responsibility to ensure that we conduct ourselves with the highest ethical standards, but we should also expect the same from those around us. Ignoring bad behavior by your fellow employees can only lead to bigger problems, and if you witness unethical behavior, please let someone know, whether that be your supervisor, the department's legal office, BHR, or even myself. Our reasons for emphasizing ethical behavior in the department is not because we think we have a problem. Quite the opposite. I'm very proud of the fact to know that we as a department conduct ourselves at a very high ethical standard. The reason we continue to emphasize it is that we can never become complacent on the issue. As soon as we become complacent, we start slipping into bad habits that can lead to bigger problems down the road. The purpose of this video is to hopefully provide some help, guidance, and real-life examples to you of situations that can occur. I asked Winter Area Engineer Doug Sherman and Chief Legal Counsel Carla Engel to share some of their thoughts with you on ethics and ethical behavior. I found their comments to be thought-provoking and a good reminder to me of why it's important that we not only talk the talk but walk the walk when it comes to ethical behavior. Hopefully, after watching the video, you will find it to be helpful to you should you find yourself in a situation where you're faced with a difficult ethical decision.
All right, well, thank you all for coming today. I'm Doug Sherman. I'm the area engineer in Winter. I'm here today to talk to you guys about ethics. Before I dive into ethics, I do want to say a few words here about what motivates me and why I'm here, up here talking to you all. I'm not here to preach to everyone. I'm not here to basically tell you how you should be thinking and acting. That's not what motivates me, and that's not why I'm here. I'm here instead because I'm a long-term state employee right now. I've been a state employee roughly 27 years now, and I've been an area engineer about 18 years. And during that time, I've seen the devastating effects of ethical compromise and what that can do to people. Some of those people were very close friends of mine. And my motivation is if I can help someone else to think before they act, before they step across that line they shouldn't step across, then I'll volunteer to do that every time. And that's why I'm here today. To begin our talk on ethics, I think it's kind of important we first gain an understanding of what ethics themselves are and what they are not. Ethics are not simply about just following the law or following what some religion says. When you think about it, think about some of those radical Islamic countries right now. They have laws based off some of religion where a person who's hungry steals a loaf of bread might get their arm chopped off, might get beheaded, put to death. In our country, we would view that kind of stuff as pretty unethical. Ethics more are what society itself accepts as right and wrong. That's really what ethics are. It's what about your society around you accepts as right and wrong. Ethics can also be very dynamic. They can change on us sometimes. Something might be ethical one day, and a few days later, or a few years later, who knows, it might turn unethical. A good example is we've seen in the National Football League here recently. Wasn't that long ago when you'd see a guy on the field take a hard hit, probably get his bell rung, and they'd haul him off. He'd sit out a couple of plays, and you'd see the coaches over there saying, hey, suck it up. If we're going to win, you've got to suck it up. You got to get back in this game and play. That was viewed as okay. Nowadays, guy gets his bell rung on the field, there's concussion protocol, because we know between what the doctors and everyone have said, the damaging effects we can have if we put someone back into activity too soon after a concussion. So nowadays, if a coach were to do that, it'd be considered very unethical. So ethics can be very dynamic, and they can change on us pretty dramatically, sometimes pretty quickly. One thing about ethics, though, that's important to remember is they are the foundation of every highly respected organization in this world. And like a building built on top of a foundation, if you have a weak foundation, the building could topple. Ethics form the very foundational core of what we are as an organization. They're what hold us in place and what make the building solid that sits on top of it. The best companies, the best organizations in the world not only embrace ethics from their upper management, but their whole workforce embrace it too. Things like professionalism, integrity are stressed all the way from entry-level workers all the way up to the CEO or the secretary. Unfortunately, though, in the world we live in, there is something known as the moral vacuum. The moral vacuum is when good people, for whatever reason, make a mistake. They get sucked in to doing something that they probably shouldn't have done. And when they do, they find they've maybe crossed that line and committed an ethical compromise. When those people, for whatever reason, cross that line and have broken that boundary of ethics and have compromised that line, it tends to make the news, especially in a large organization such as a state government organization like we are with DOT. And when that kind of stuff makes the news, it's not good news. It's very devastating, not only to the individual, but it's also devastating to the entire organization. Take an example of an employee who maybe made a decision, a poor one someday, to put some state-owned gas in a personal vehicle. And he gets caught, and it makes KELOLAND news. Think about how society looks at that when they see the news. They aren't looking at it as, I'm glad they caught that one bad apple doing that. Society's more stereotyping us all together. They're looking at, I wonder how many more of them out there are doing it. And that's how you start wearing away at that foundation. You start wearing away at the public trust. And the next thing you know, everything starts crumbling around you. Another example is one I can tell you I know absolutely nothing about. It's the EB-5 program. I know absolutely nothing about that program. I don't pretend to know anything about it. But I bring it up because it's a great example what can happen with the media and the public if there's even the slightest perception that an ethical compromise has taken place. The media and the public are relentless on those kind of things, especially if it's a governmental agency. They're like piranha attacking, something fresh in the water. They're going to keep gnawing away until they get to the bone, and they're not going to stop. So we, as a group, very important, we cannot let ourselves get sucked into that moral vacuum, sucked into thinking that something's okay when it's not okay. Ethical compromises generally arise from two sources. The first is employee misconduct themselves, and the second is agency indifference. We're going to talk about both of them here in quite a bit of detail. On the employee misconduct side, generally three sources will pop up, rear their head, that will lead to employee misconduct and cause someone to cross that boundary of ethical compromise. The first one is anger. That's when you're mad at the organization. Maybe you feel like you should have got a pay raise, or maybe you feel like you should have got a promotion that you didn't get. And you're mad at the organization. You start feeling like, they owe me something. Greed is when you start using your job in a way that's pretty much unlawful to try and make money. With the greed side of it, you might have some insider information about a project that's going to increase property values or something like that. So you let some friends know about it and you get in on that. You make money off of it because of your job. Or it might be as simple as taking state-owned property and taking it for your own personal use. Taking equipment for your own personal use. Or maybe taking something that might have been garbage and selling it for your own personal use. Peer pressure happens when a group, usually kind of a smaller group, gets together and they all kind of decide, well, if something's okay with one or two people, it's probably okay with everyone else. That might be something such as not charging meals proper on a timesheet. You might have a couple guys in a crew say, oh, it's all right, we get paid low enough anyway, we're going to charge the meal, even though the policy says we don't get the meal. And everyone around it goes with it because they don't want to upset the apple cart. That's peer pressure. Agency indifference, though, is the other kind, and I'd make some argument that that's probably the bigger evil of both of them. Agency indifference happens when unethical behavior is ignored or it's allowed to continue without any repercussions. In essence, things are just swept under the rug because you don't want to deal with them. There is probably not a more destructive thing that a business or an organization can do than to have agency indifference and sweep things under the rug and ignore the fact that they're taking place or that they happened. The best example I can give you in the history of the United States where agency indifference played a major role in bringing someone down is the Watergate scandal of the 1970s. I think history would argue right now that President Nixon himself really didn't know much about the break-in when it first occurred at the Watergate Hotel. What happened afterwards is what got him though. When he did find out about it, he got involved in all the lies, all the deceit, all the cover-up that went along with trying to keep what happened from the public. And all those lies eventually brought him to the point where the President of the United States himself had to resign in disgrace. Think about how President Nixon's presidency might be different, looked upon by history nowadays, had he simply held those people accountable right from the get-go. If he'd have gone before the media and said, I need to apologize, some people acting on my behalf, thinking they were acting on my behalf anyway, broke in and committed a heinous act, and as such, I'm going to hold them accountable. I suspect Watergate wouldn't have lasted on the news for more than a few days. You look at some other histories of the United States here. You have that PG&E scandal out in California that made the Aaron Brockovich movie. That's another one. You've got the agency in that case covering up that they're dumping chemicals into the water. You know, it's all about making money. Forget about what we're doing to people. You got the cigarette makers of the 1950s and 60s telling us our research has indicated cigarettes do not cause cancer. Kind of the Pinocchio syndrome. Their nose really should have been growing every time they said that. Agency indifference is very, very dangerous. There's also a danger all of us as human beings need to look out for, and that's this development of a perceived sense of being a victim. Humans by nature have this ability to rationalize things in their minds, and sometimes we can rationalize things to be okay when in reality they're not okay. Look at that example I brought up earlier about a person putting some gas in their vehicle where they shouldn't have. You know, let's take that example a little further. Let's say that same person didn't get a pay raise for several years. And because of that, he's now rationalizing in his head, you know what, they didn't give me a raise. So I'm going to get something back. They owe me. So I'm going to put some gas in my vehicle. That's what this kind of perceived sense of being a victim allows us in our minds to do, and it's a very, very dangerous way of thinking. When we start thinking that way, I'll use kind of a Star Wars analogy, it's a pathway to the dark side. It can really lead us down a dark tunnel when we start rationalizing things as being okay in our minds that we know better. We know they're not okay. Look at some recent events: Ferguson, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland. We had some events in both places involving some questionable acts by the police. No doubt about it, very questionable acts. I'm not going to get into that part of it. What I am going to get into, though, is what the mob mentality did after the questionable acts took place. You have mobs of people, many coming in not from Ferguson and not from Baltimore, many coming in from outside cities because it was opportunity for them to make their point. They're coming in with that victimization approach that because that event happened, it's now okay for me to go topple cars, burn buildings, break windows, steal merchandise. People are able to rationalize just about anything is okay, even though it's not okay. Because, I mean, think about it. Those store owners, they didn't shoot or harm either of those individuals. So why should they be punished with their stores looted, their property stolen, their windows broken? Employees in organizations who are at the greatest risk of feeling victimized are those who kind of overinvest in that they really get involved in something to a point where they kind of feel there should be some sort of reward at the end. And when that reward doesn't come or the organization doesn't recognize them, they start taking that sense of being a victim again. Like I said, very, very dangerous way of thinking. I don't know if any of you have ever watched a TV show called Breaking Bad. And I see some hands. How many? A few of you have. And it's okay if you haven't watched it. But in Breaking Bad, it's a good example of how this can play out, this perceived sense of being a victim. The show starts out with a very hard-working, honest man named Walter White is a chemistry teacher. Worked hard his whole life. He's just turned 50 years old. In fact, to make ends meet for his family, I should say, he has to work 2 jobs. He's also washing cars at a car wash too, because we all know teachers don't get paid that greatest. But anyway, one day Walter, who's a chemistry teacher, learns he has lung cancer. He also learns at the same time that his insurance isn't going to cover everything he needs for the treatments. So as such, he's going to have a very devastating financial impact on his family just to keep him alive. Walter takes this information and he's able to rationalize in his head that I got to do what I got to do to protect my family. And as such, it leads him into a very dark world of making methamphetamine. Little by little, he lets the moral vacuum keep sucking him in deeper and deeper into that world. Eventually gets to a point where he rationalizes it's okay to even kill people if I have to protect myself or protect my family. Now that example, fortunately, is just TV, thank goodness. But I think we all need to be careful because there can be a little bit of Walter White in all of us. We have that ability to rationalize things as being okay in our heads when they're not okay. That's why I want to talk about some things now we as individuals can do to help ourselves and to keep ourselves out of trouble when it comes to ethical compromise. There's several things we can do here, several questions we can ask ourselves first off that'll help us through that process. And if you can answer yes to every one of these, you know what, you're probably okay to do what you're thinking of doing, whatever that is. But if you have to answer no to any of these, I'd be careful. I'd be very careful. First one is it worth my job? Is it worth my career or my family if I do this? Now, as you think about these, think about that example of the employee who rationalized that it's okay to take state-owned gas and put it in a personal vehicle. It'd be hard to say, yeah, it's worth it for whatever 5-10 gallons is worth, you know, $10-15 cost a person his livelihood. Is what I'm doing legal? I mean, could the police come around? Could DCI be coming around if I do this? How am I going to feel about myself 20 years from now, even if I get away with it? Am I going to have guilt? Am I going to feel guilty about it? Am I portraying a professional and respectful attitude about the people, the organization that were good enough to hire me as an individual at one point in time? Would the people that love me the most, would they be proud of me for doing this? Or would they be ashamed of me if I did this? Does what I'm about to do comply with my understanding of our value system in this organization, in our country? If I do it, am I going to feel bad about it right away? How am I going to look if what I do makes the newspaper? Remember, most ethical compromises, especially in large organizations like we are, they will make the newspaper, and don't think otherwise. Or even worse, how's it going to look when KELOLAND TV gets a hold of it? Because they probably will. And the best question of all, if you want, what would your grandma think of you if you do that? Most grandmas would probably frown upon a person taking gas. Something else we can also do is we can also adopt some rules to live by. Now, I call them rules to live by versus law, but where these come from, which I'm about to show you, are things that I pulled from the Ethics in Government Act, originally passed by Congress in 1978, and I think it was amended in 1989. The Ethics in Government Act is an act Congress passed after the Watergate scandal in an effort to prevent something like that from ever happening again. These rules to live by that I'm talking about here are actual laws that apply to federal government workers. Now again, they passed it with federal government in mind, not state, so technically they're not all laws with us, but they are great rules we can live by. First one is to remember that public service is a public trust. It requires service to the public over private gain. In other words, remember, we're not here to serve ourselves. We're not here to serve our friends. We are here, though, to serve the public. As such, there shall be no financial conflicts of interest. Now that one, a little bit has just changed on that. Our legislature this past winter has passed a new law dealing with state employees in conflict of interest. So there is laws governing us on that right now, and we all need to be aware of those. Employees should put forth an honest effort in their work. That is actual federal law for federal government employees. So if a federal government employee is sitting around looking at Facebook all day long, not doing anything, technically they are actually breaking the law. For us, we need to look at it as That's simply wasting tax dollars, and it's wrong. Very unethical. Employees may not use their position for private gain. As I said earlier, we're not here to serve ourselves. We're not here to serve our friends. We're here to serve everyone. And in doing so, we need to act impartial in the exercise of our duties. No special favors for anyone. We are our neutral party. Employees are to conserve government property and not use it in any manner except for that which it was authorized. That's our computers, that's our cell phones, that's our state vehicles. All of them should be state government business when we're using those. We are to disclose waste and fraud to authorities when we see it. And remember, we're all adults now. We're not in high school anymore. And we all know the devastating impact that ethical compromise can have to our organization. So if somebody is out there committing fraud and they get caught, it could bring our whole organization down pretty hard. And if we can do something to prevent it, that's our responsibility as employees. We should be reporting that to authorities. We also need to go out of our way to avoid even the appearance of violating law or ethical standards of this order, because our image to the public is everything. And if the public doesn't trust us, they don't trust us to be ethical in our decision making, we're going to find sooner or later the public's going to look to find someone that they can trust. And that again can have some very devastating impacts to us. So even the appearance of an ethics violation is very, very dangerous to us. Let's look at case study number 1 here first. Garbage is garbage. What we have here in the case study, pretty typical of our maintenance crews. It's spring. Been a long, hard winter pretty much, and the guys are doing some spring cleanup. As such, quite a bit of stuff that they're throwing away. With one little thing at the end though. After they've thrown stuff away, the crew goes around, starts picking and choosing stuff out of the garbage that, since it's garbage, they can just take home with them. Because the statement at the end, we all know that no one cares what happens to it as long as it's out of the yard. Now, state garbage. How is that different from normal garbage? It's different by one very clear, distinctive thing. Can anybody get it? State garbage is still 100% state-owned property, period. Doesn't belong to anyone but the state of South Dakota, even though it's in the garbage pile. So the first thing, when you start taking garbage out of there, you got to remember you're taking state property, even if it is garbage, and that is theft. That alone will get a person in some major hot water. It's also gaining financially from your position. No one from the public had the ability to go get that garbage. Only you and your crew knew about it. The other thing I would stress in this one, imagine how long it would be with roughly, about 14,000 state employees. Imagine how long it would be before one of those 14,000 started throwing stuff away simply because I could use this at home. I think I'm just going to throw it away and call it garbage. What do you think the odds or the probability of that happening with roughly 14,000 individuals working in state government? The odds are that could happen. At least somebody, one person out there might rationalize, you know what, this laptop's garbage, I'm going to throw it away, and then later on pick it out and say, that's just state garbage, I'm going to take it home. State garbage is still state property, period. And we all got to remember this. Okay, case study number 2, how hot is too hot? Here we have your typical engineering crew on a concrete paving job with a specification in place saying that 90 degrees is your upper limit. If the concrete temperature reaches 90, according to the spec book, we should make the contractor cease operations. So in this case here, we've got a contractor who was really kicking butt that day. Crew's liking what they're seeing, everything's going good, and they're kind of wondering, just because we got 91 degrees, why should we have to shut this contractor down? So they make a conscious choice. They get together as a group, and instead of calling it 91 degrees, they call it 89 degrees, and they let the contractor keep going. No one's the wiser. The question I have here, is it ever okay for us as employees to falsify a test document? No. The answer on that is unanimously no. It's not okay to do that. In fact, we have to put an electronic signature on those documents right now. And I would argue that by doing what they did here, they're probably committing an act of perjury. They could be in a lot of hot water for that one. You know, is only being out by 1 degree overlookable? You know, I've heard that argument for 27 years from contractors. Come on, it's only 1% out of sieve, or it's 1 degree. Why is that such a big deal? The big deal comes in the fact that when our own crews as individuals start picking and choosing when it's okay to step outside of those parameters set in the spec book, where do you draw the line? The next thing you know, you're 5 and 6% out, and you're still saying it's okay, or you're 5 and 6 degrees out. Where do you draw that line? Once you cross that line and you start, you know, making the spec book turn into more of a guideline than a spec book. Does paving have to be stopped in every case here? You know, as written, I would argue yes, but I can tell you in reality, maybe. If you get the right people together, you can turn something very unethical here into ethical. 99 times out of 100, you're going to get the same answer from those right people on this, and that is shut them down. But there might be that one time where you've got just the right factors together, where the region engineer, the concrete paving engineer, the area engineer are talking about it, and that those three as a group make the decision, you know, in this case, I think we could allow them to pave a little longer. But there you've got people who have the authority level to make that decision, making that call. Not a technician out on the job, not the project engineer on the job. Hence, you take it, you turn something unethical, ethical. Realistically, that conversation, like I say, 99 times out of 100, is going to be, no, that's the spec, stop them. And that's what we have to do. That's our job. But there are those cases. There's always those cases out there. But the important point is, if those cases do happen where something maybe isn't right, maybe it isn't always right to follow what it says in the book, then you need to get the right people involved versus just doing something on your own and assuming you're okay to do it. If you get the right level of authority involved, then maybe sometimes it is okay to deviate a little. Case study number 3, late again. Here we have a case where Andy's coming into work about 10 minutes late on a pretty regular basis. He's confronted by his coworker Ted, and Andy admits he overslept again. Tim informs him that it's important to be on time and be out on the project, and Andy kind of blows it off as, doesn't really matter, they don't start working until 7:30 anyway. And because of that, it's late season paving, you know, I'll be there by the time they start, everything will be okay. At the end of the pay period, Ted does notice it, that Andy's still showing 6 on his timesheet. He thinks about it, but he decides, why bother with it? You know, it's only 10 minutes, really not a big deal. And in the end, Andy's there when he needs to be, so there's really nothing wrong. Is it okay if it's only 10 minutes? The answer to that is no. It's not okay. The big thing I would stress here is probably the fact that not only is it 10 minutes, but it's the milking of the system, working of the system that I'm seeing. If he doesn't need to be out at the plant site until 7:30, and he doesn't need to be at work at 6, why is he getting paid overtime there? That's costing all tax dollars a lot of money unwarranted That's unethical. That's wrong. You know, and another thing I want to throw in here, it's similar, not covered in this scenario, but talk about employees also adjusting their time to get a meal on a timesheet. That's kind of similar. So, I mean, it's really no different. The policy there says 11:30 till 1. You have to be outside of your workstation, outside city limits to get a meal. So you shouldn't be just leaving right at 11:30 just to make sure you get the meal when it's something you could have done at 8 o'clock. Very similar. Last thing in this one is I want to note the fact that we do have attendance guidelines with the DOT, and those should have been followed in this case. And the attendance guidelines are a step-by-step process where if somebody is regularly late to work time after time, you have step discipline in place. At first it starts with a warning, then it leads to time off, then it can lead to termination, excuse me. But the big thing is we do have policies there, and as workers, you know, we have to follow those policies. I am an engineer, and as such I love to do math. So let's do a little bit of math here on what 10 minutes late can actually do just once per week. So let's ask ourselves first a question. What if every state employee in a DOT come to work 10 minutes late once per week, just once? It's roughly 1,000 of us. So you take 1,000 people times the 10 minutes, times 52 weeks a year, divide by 60 for the minutes in the hour, and you get 8,667 hours of basically wasted time if every single state employee does that once per week all year long. Now, I don't have exact numbers here, but I know there's between 13 and 14,000 state employees altogether, so I use 14,000. So if you take 14,000, then you have every state worker in South Dakota doing this, then all of a sudden you have 121,333 hours being wasted. That's our taxpayers' money being wasted. If you assume an average salary of $20 an hour, I don't know that that's average, it's just a number I'm using. In the DOT alone, we'd be wasting about $173,000 a year. And in the state government alone, we'd be wasting roughly $2.4 million. Keep in mind, all of these are without payroll additives. Payroll additives are things like what our fringe benefits are worth. So those are real numbers too that would even escalate these costs. So in reality, 10 minutes can really matter, and we really are harming our customers and probably harming our ethical foundation when we do things like that. The best advice I can give employees when it comes to ethics is trust your instincts. Trust what you know is right and wrong. Every human has a sense of what's right and wrong. It's what separates us from the animal kingdom. It's what makes us what we are. We do have that ability to rationalize things that I talked about. That can be both dangerous, but it can also be our greatest strength. It's what makes us who we are. So, you know, trust those instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong and we shouldn't be doing it. And if you don't know whether something's wrong, ask someone, consult with someone. Good example, not too long ago, my mother-in-law was sick with an illness. I wasn't sure if I could use personal leave on that or not. So I asked BHR, and I found out, yeah, you can use it, versus just assuming that I could do it. You know, if you're not sure, ask. DOT, again, is a large organization, roughly 1,000 people. We have public trust very strong amongst us right now. We wouldn't have gotten a gas tax increase if the public didn't trust us with that money. So right now, the public trust in us is high. We got to remember that. As an organization, if our members do things that might hurt or harm that trust, then we harm our whole organization. We're not harming individuals, we're harming everybody. Without ethics, remember, the whole building could crumble, because ethics are the foundation of which we sit upon. The best way we can keep the public trust is just simply by being ethical in everything we do, everywhere we do it. Finally, be untouchable as you go about your jobs. In the 1920s, a famous gangster, Al Capone, rose to power during the Prohibition era. He did this largely due to the fact that policemen at the time, judges at the time, public employees like they weren't getting paid a lot of money. A lot of people disagreed with Prohibition. They thought it was kind of a stupid law. As such, it was pretty easy for Capone to get into the police, to get to the judges, and pay them bribes. And they'd look the other way and let him just do his business. A very evil guy, Al Capone, rose to great power because of that. But he was brought down later on by a group known as the Untouchables. They were untouchable because they wouldn't compromise their ethics. They wouldn't breach those ethics. They wouldn't let Capone buy them off. And eventually that led to Al Capone going to jail, where he belonged. So I close by just telling you guys as you go about your careers, be untouchable. Don't let anyone or anything compromise your ethics.
All right, my name is Carla Engel, and I work at the DOT Legal Office. And I'm here this afternoon to talk about ethics. And in preparing for this discussion, I think I have thought about this more than any other presentation I have ever given. And one of the first things that I struggled with is why me? Why me? Because the truth of the matter is that every one of us struggles with ethical decisions all of the time, in work and in life. It's part of the human condition. And I think all of us have to find our way. And so I spent a lot of time trying to think about what I can contribute to this discussion. And ethics are, I started by thinking about what are ethics? Where do they derive from? Where do they come from? What are they? And really, ethics are communal. You know, there's a TV show, The Last Man on Earth. It's this idea of being alone on the earth. If that were true, if I was the last person on earth, there would be no ethics. Because ethics are really about how we relate to one another and the rules that apply, how we're going to interact and how those relationships are going to work. So I think ethics really are a community thing. So where does that get us within DOT? How does that work? And it got me thinking about what is the biggest source of ethical lapses? When are we most at risk? And to be quite honest, I thought about myself. When do I struggle the most? And all of us have our best self and our worst self. I mean, that's true. We all do. And there are times when we have been our best self, and there are times when we've been our worst self. So I thought about myself and when I am most likely to be my worst self. And two things came to mind. And this is about me. I mean, this is my own problems, but I think it's true for a lot of folks. One is, I think I'm my worst self, or can be. I'm most at risk of being my worst self when I am facing a mistake that I've made, or a failure. That's very, very hard to deal with. How do we deal with our own mistakes and failures? And I gotta tell you, I have big ones. If you are thinking that you're the biggest screw up in this place, well, I can give you a run for your money. And I'll give you an example. I worked on a case, it was a condemnation case. It was the first thing I started working on when I came to DOT. And I spent 7 years, no, actually it would be 9 years. 9 years working on that case, and it was a big case. And it went up to the Supreme Court twice. I won it a couple times, the trial court level, but the second time it got to the Supreme Court, I lost. And that case cost the Department of Transportation $3.4 million. And so that is one of my failures. And one of the things they don't teach you in law school is that in litigation, there's a winner and a loser. It's that stark. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Very rarely do both people walk out of a trial or a court case or a hearing where both people won. It's very harsh. Somebody's going to win and somebody is going to lose. But what they don't teach you is how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to address that? You know, when I lost that case, it was very, very hard. I wanted to win. And I lost it, and then I had to keep working on it because the court had said, yes, there was a taking, and now you owe, and I had to keep working on that case. And it was so hard to pick up that case and figure out what to do next. And so I think that mistakes, when we have a mistake, that's one area where we're at risk. Another time that I think that we're at risk is when we're isolated. Because again, ethics are communal. It's our relationship to other people. And the more separated you get from other people, and the less help and support that you feel like you have, I think the more likely you are to make poor choices. And so how do we, as a community, as the DOT community, how do we fight some of those things? How do we fight and address those things? And I have to tell you, and if people ask me, I like to think I'm candid. I hope to be kind, but I also hope to be candid. And so I'm going to be very candid with you today. And I think here at DOT, we don't spend a lot of time talking about how to deal with mistakes. We talk a lot about how to avoid mistakes. And that's a good thing. That's important. Clear communication about expectations, about how you should behave. I think that's very important, and I don't mean to demean that or diminish it. But I got news for all of you. We're all humans. We are going to make mistakes. So we better think about how are we going to deal with them? And how, as part of a community, are we going to support each other when we make mistakes? And I thought a lot about examples that I could bring to you to talk in human terms and real terms about mistakes. And there's one, it has haunted me. This came up when I was in law school, and it has haunted me for all these years. When I was in law school, I got a summer job. And it was with a law firm that did a bunch of medical malpractice work. And one of the first days at work, one of the lead lawyers says to me, I want you to come with me to some depositions. And depositions are when you have somebody who offers testimony under oath. And you question them, the lawyers question them, they can make objections, and there's cross-examination. But it's basically testimony outside of the presence of the judge or jury. And the point of a deposition is to really get somebody's testimony down. And there's a court reporter there who records their testimony, and then there's a written transcript. And then you can use that testimony later in the trial, but it's a way of finding out what people have to say. Well, he took me to these depositions, and he deliberately did not tell me what they were about. So I just showed up. I'm a law student. I'd never been to depositions before. I sat next to him, and he started questioning, and there were two nurses. And they testified not together, it was one after the other. And the story that unfolded, I mean, it's really quite tragic. And, you know, I thought about whether it was even appropriate to talk to you about it. But I think it's important for us to be willing to talk about mistakes and how small mistakes can become big ones. And the story that unfolded that day was that there was a nurse, and she was in the pediatric unit, and there was a boy. He didn't have a life-threatening problem, but he was on morphine. They were treating him with some morphine. He was 5 years old. And the nurse went in and gave him a dose of morphine. She went back to chart, and she realized that she had given him, I think it was 10 times, I think she'd mistakenly multiplied it by 10, the amount of morphine that this little boy should get. She alerted the head nurse that was on. It was late at night too, it was like the middle of the night. She alerted the head nurse, and they went running back to this little boy's room, and they pulled out the IV, and I remember them talking about the fluid draining onto the floor, spilling onto the floor. And then they started talking about what they were going to do. And what they decided to do was the head nurse did this calculation, and she said, you know, based on the rate of delivery and the amount of the dosage, I don't think he got very much. And so I think we're good. And they went back to the chart, and they falsified the chart as far as what he'd been delivered. And they went through the rest of the shift. At the very end of the shift, somebody called a code on this little boy. And that means over the PA system, they announced code and they gave the room number. The head nurse had already left. The original nurse who dispensed the medication, she hadn't left yet. What did she do? She went and got her coat and her purse, and she went home. And what I learned during the course of this deposition is there's actually an antidote for morphine. And had they called the physician, he could have prescribed the antidote, and this little boy's life would have been saved. Why do you think they didn't do that? What do you think they said? They said things like, when we call doctors, they get mad. We were pretty sure we'd be in a lot of trouble for reporting this mistake. We thought we had it handled. And I remember walking out of that deposition, and the first thing that the lawyer that I was there with, he said, well, what did you think? And I was mortified. And I was just so furious. And I remember my young self talking very critically about these ladies. And I do not mean to excuse what they did. It was a terrible thing. But I've thought a lot about them since then, especially because in law, one of the things I've realized over time, I guess it should have occurred to me long ago, we deal in mistakes. All litigation is about mistakes. Either we're claiming somebody else made a mistake, or they're claiming we made a mistake. And somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And because I'm a lot older, and because I've been kicked around by life myself, I've started to think more about how might those nurses have been helped? How might there have been an environment where they would have felt not only comfortable but compelled to call, where they would have felt supported? Now maybe they would have made the same choice, I don't know. But one thing that I've learned over time, and I didn't know this at the time, but there's this whole paradigm now in the healthcare field, and you'll also see it in like airlines, and it's called a just culture. And they have a just culture algorithm. And when I first heard about this, I looked into it myself because I remembered that case and I wanted to know more about it. And the idea behind this just culture is that there are really 3 responses that you want to have to any kind of failure or mistake. And you need to decide what is the appropriate response. And the 3 responses are, one is to console. And you console when there's been like human error. And you want to comfort somebody, but there's really not, it's not like there's a fault situation. You console people. If people have a setback, They make a mistake, you console. Second, you coach. You coach. What would have happened if there had been an environment with these ladies where they knew, if I call, I'm going to get help. And they're going to help coach me so that this doesn't happen again. Because do I think those ladies wanted that little boy to die? And he did die. Do I think they wanted him to die? No. They made some bad choices. But were there things that could have been done to help encourage them to make good choices? And I think if they felt they would have been coached, maybe that would have made a difference. I don't know. And the third is punish. And punish is really where people engage in reckless behavior, people engage in crimes, thievery, stealing, lying, harassing. Those are things you can't tolerate. And some things do deserve punishment. Now in this case, these nurses, they most certainly were punished. And that was the appropriate response. They were punished. They lost their nursing licenses, they lost their jobs, and they found themselves in this civil lawsuit. I don't know if they were ever criminally prosecuted. I don't know the answer to that. I was involved in the civil lawsuit. But one of the things that I think we need to think about is how can we encourage people when they make a small mistake to seek help so it doesn't become a big mistake. And, you know, it's easy to say, well, that's for the executive team, or that's for supervisors, or, you know, that's for the secretary. But the truth is, every one of us in the work that we do, we encounter people who make mistakes. How are we going to help them? What response do we want them to have? That's something for us to think about. And as a supervisor, I think about it a lot. As a lawyer, with my clients, I think about it. What should be my first response when somebody comes in with a lawsuit or a claim or a problem? Do I console? Do I coach? Should there be some kind of punishment? I need to be thinking about those things. I also want to talk about somebody who's an example of a great response to a mistake. I was sitting in my office one day and I got a call from somebody here at DOT, and she called me and she said, you know, you sent out some guidance on this statute, and I realized I was doing the opposite. And so I went out and I did X, Y, Z. So now what do? Can you help me? I have to say, my first response when I heard her call me, she didn't have to call me. I never would have known about it. Frankly, her boss never would have known about it either. She could have just swept it under the rug. I was so impressed that she called and said, I've been doing this wrong. Can you help me figure this out? And there was a pretty straightforward solution. We figured it out. I worked with her supervisor. I worked with her. We came up with a solution. We resolved it, and we moved on. But you know what I felt after she came to me and talked to me about that? I felt admiration. I so admired her for coming forward and reporting a mistake that she didn't have to do. She never had to tell anybody about that. She could have swept it under the rug. And after I talked to her and we got it resolved, I sent an email to her supervisor and her supervisor's supervisor. And I said, you know, this lady, she made a mistake. And she asked for help and she figured it out. And I so admire her. And I want to commend her. Now, I never got a response, so I don't know how that was received. But I can tell you a few years later, she asked me to be a reference for her. And I got called by the people who were looking at her for a job. And they asked me all the usual questions, you know. And at the end, he said to me, well, is there anything else that you think I should know? And I said, yeah. I want to tell you about when this person made a mistake. And then I described the situation. And I said, you know, this person to me, this is an example of somebody with integrity. And this is an example of somebody that I want to be like. Because I think it's more important, the mistakes aren't what matters. It's how we respond to them. And this person has figured out how to respond to them. But the other thing that I felt after that whole thing, besides admiration for this person, was I felt good about me. Because she'd come to me and asked for help, and I was able to give it. And so it was a good feeling for me. And isn't that true for all of us? Don't you feel good when you help somebody out? So in thinking about how can we improve things here at DOT, and I have to admit, I'm not always my best self. But I think one of the ways that we can make a more ethical workplace is to be that person for somebody. If you see somebody struggling, if you see somebody making mistakes, how hard would it be to say, can I help you? How can I help you? About 2 months ago, I got a call from somebody. And he was very concerned about one of his employees. And the employee was in trouble, and it had some legal aspects to it. And so he called me because he wanted to know some general legal information and what kind of resources were out there. And so we talked about that. But then he asked me a very interesting question. He said to me, well, I mean, this is a personal thing. So should I say anything to this person? Should I even talk to them? Because it's not work related, but it's personal, but you know, I can see it happening, and I think it's going to affect work. So should I say anything? What do you think I told him? I hope so. I hope you do. Please do. Please do. Because if you see somebody struggling, if it were you, wouldn't you want somebody to reach out a hand and try to help you, whether it's your boss or somebody else? I mean, if nothing else, if ethics is communal, doesn't it start by all of us agreeing to care about one another? Trying to look out for one another? And that kind of gets me to the next part of my discussion, which is really about isolation. You know, I think that's kind of the flip side of what we were talking about, making mistakes and having somebody to talk to about them. But I think when we become isolated, I think that's when we're really at risk for making poor ethical choices, because ethics, again, is communal. And when you're separated from the group, it's so much easier to make a bad decision. And I saw a quote, it stuck with me. It just really stuck with me, and I'm embarrassed to say that I had not figured this out as a supervisor for a very, very long time. And the quote is, what you permit, you promote. What you permit, you promote. And it's really, really true. For the longest time as a supervisor, I would see things happening in my office and I think, well, why did they do that? Why aren't they more like this? Or why didn't they do that? But I was very reluctant to confront people. It's very hard to confront people. You know, to actually go up to somebody and say, you know, your performance on that wasn't up to our standards. Or, you know, we don't treat people like that. And I came up with a lot of excuses. And I'm so busy, I've got this going on, and well, they should know that. And it was easy to come up with a lot of excuses. But what I figured out as a supervisor is as soon as you know about it, it's yours. That person who's performing poorly, as soon as you know about it and you do nothing, now that's you. You own it. That other person who's nasty to people, mean, doing things they shouldn't do, saying things they shouldn't, as soon as you know about it, It's yours. Because what you permit, you promote. As soon as I realized that, that was a big incentive for me to get off my butt, to stop making excuses, and to start confronting things. Start confronting things. But for a long time, I thought that was just a thing for supervisors. But actually, it's true all across the board. I mean, isn't that true with your kids? With your spouse? With your friends? With your coworkers? What you permit, you promote. It becomes yours. So how do you confront people? And honestly, this is something it's hard. I have struggled with it. I have failed many times. But I'd like to think I'm getting better at it, because I keep thinking about that. What you permit, you promote. And there was a great thing just a short time ago. I read those Tuesday tips. I don't know if you guys get those. They're really great. Some of them are better than others. But there was one, and I'm a big one for steps. I got to know steps. If I have a little outline of what to do, that helps me. And this is what it said, and I just think it's so, so good. Ask yourself 3 questions. First, is it true? Are you acting off of rumor or guesswork or just a vague feeling? Or do you know? Yes, they did this and it was poor work. Yes, they had this deadline and they missed it. Yes, they have this coworker and they treated him like this. Is it true? Secondly, is it necessary? Am I nitpicking? Or is it really important? Is this important that we address it? Is it true? Is it necessary? And third, and I think this is what makes it easier to confront, is it kind? Is it kind? And so when I approach somebody, what I usually try to say, or I usually try to talk about in that conversation, is what they do good. What I like about their work. What I like about them. What I want for them. Start there. Start with kindness. And then it makes it easier to talk about truth. So those are things, and I got to tell you, I don't always do it, don't always make it, but it helps so much to have some kind of a framework to work from. In terms of isolation, so I think, part of isolation, people get isolated. If you don't confront them, they're going to become more isolated. If they don't do good work, people are going to start avoiding them, and they're going to become isolated. If they're treating people in ways they shouldn't be treated, they're going to become isolated. That becomes an ethical issue. But I've also looked in my career here at DOT, is I've tried to look for ways to avoid isolation, to try to encourage my employees to become part of the community, and also make myself part of the community. And one of the best experiences that I've ever had, and if you haven't done it yet, I would encourage you to do it, is the mentoring program. And what I loved about the mentoring program, I've shared with you a little bit about my own failures as a supervisor. When I started in a supervisory position, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. But I recognized, I could see that I didn't know what I was doing. I knew that there was things to learn and I wasn't quite sure how to learn them. And along came the mentoring program. And what I love about the mentoring program is it's mentee driven. I didn't need somebody to tell me how I was failing. I knew. But I didn't know where to go. And so I thought, well, what do I got to lose? I'll try this mentoring thing. And one of the things I loved about it is there was this confidential relationship that got created. So I could actually go to my mentor and I could say to my mentor, I don't know what I'm doing, would you help me? I don't know what I'm doing. And he helped me. And I was so grateful for that. And so I would really encourage you, if you haven't done it, it's a great opportunity. Think about something that you want to work on yourself. Think about some area that you want to learn more about or you want to improve about yourself. It's a great option. It's a great option. And the other nice thing about the mentoring program is once you've been a mentee, then you can be a mentor. And you can pass that experience along. If anything, what I'd love to see the mentoring program do is expand beyond where it's at. And I'd love to see all of these informal mentors and all of these ways that we can develop each other to be mentors to one another throughout our workday. Because I think that we're all hungry for that. There's a quote by somebody that I really admire, and I think it's really true. And here's another instance of me being candid. DOT is a very hierarchical organization. That's one of the things that I figured out. There's a hierarchy. There are benefits to that. But one of the downsides of that is I think people very often, they think change comes from up here and goes down this way. I'm not convinced of that. For one thing that I don't like about that is we have no control over, nobody here is part of the executive team, but even if you were, it's a very big ship. It's very hard to turn. And so I'm not convinced that change comes from above. In fact, I don't think change comes from above. What is the one thing that any one of us can control? Ourselves. And that's it. If you are a parent, you've figured that out. If you are a spouse, you've figured that out. If you're a supervisor, you've figured that out. If you're a human being, you've probably figured that out. The only thing we can truly change is ourselves. And the quote that I love, I think it's so true. We are the change we've been waiting for. I believe that. I believe any change that I want to affect in my work, in my family, in my life, it starts here. It starts here. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about, I'm always looking for little things to kind of keep me going. To kind of help me find my way. Because I don't know about you, but for me, life and work, it's kind of a daily struggle. Maybe you haven't had that. Maybe life isn't hard for you. Maybe work isn't hard for you. If that's the situation you're in, go home and get on your knees and thank your higher power because you have been blessed. Because for many of us, life has many hardships and many challenges, and it's not easy. And so I'm always looking for little things that will help keep me pointed in the right direction. And one of the things, again, it came from those Tuesday tips. If you come in my office, you're going to see little things taped up on the wall, and you'll see stickies on my computer. And those are the latest little things that are keeping me going. They're trying to keep me righted. And here's a few of them. And this is taped, it's been taped up there for several years, and I read it a lot to try to keep me on the right path. And I've circled some of my favorites, and here they are. And it starts out, promise yourself. And I love that. Promise yourself. Because again, the focus is on myself. What can I change? What can I do? How am I going to be? And here are some of the best ones. Promise yourself to talk health, happiness, and prosperity to every person you meet. Promise yourself to think only of the best, work only for the best, and expect only the best. To be as enthusiastic about the success of others as you are about your own. To forget the mistakes of the past and press on to the greater achievements of the future. To give so much time to the improvement of yourself that you have no time to criticize others. To be too large for worry, too noble for anger, too strong for fear, and too happy to permit the presence of trouble. Well, and actually, you know, when I'm trying to get courage, I meant to talk about this and I skipped over it. You know, the courage to confront people. Because that is a hard one. It's hard for me. But I think about people who came before, people that I admire. I mean, and you're a veteran. And I think about veterans. I mean, there are people, my uncle was a veteran. He was a gunner on a fighter plane. He got shot down over enemy territory during World War II. Some of the members of his crew died in the crash. There were a few that survived, and he was one of them. He engaged in hand-to-hand combat behind enemy lines, and he made his way back. Now that's guts. That's grit. That is courage. And I think about him when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm mamby-pambying around about going and talking to somebody about maybe a problem that I've got working with them or confronting them about their performance. And I think about this courage spectrum and where he was on it and where I want to be. Now, I'm probably never going to be over here where he was, but I sure as heck don't want to be over here. And I think it helps to think about those things. You know, to think about, where do I want to be? What do I want to do? And quotes, that helps me. I mean, maybe it's dumb, but it helps. It's kind of like having your own little value system. Okay, here's my values. It gives you a compass, kind of a direction to go from. So I want to read you one other thing. I kind of jumped around. Okay, this may sound kind of stupid too, but I went to a meeting and I got this. It was the governor's organizational chart. And I think that was the main reason why it got handed out. But down in the corner, in a little box, was something called the governor's values. And I read it. And I thought it was great. I thought it was helpful. You know, doesn't it help to kind of know, okay, these are the things that are valued. This is what is important. It kind of keeps you centered. And here's what he's got listed as his values. Servant leader. Servant leader. And as a supervisor, I mean, what I think about is, what is my job? My job, ultimately, is to help other people be successful. That is my job. And if I can help them be successful, I am successful as a supervisor. His next one is honest, genuine, willing to admit mistakes. That resonated with me because of what I've talked to you about. It's hard for me to admit mistakes. Oh, I hate it. I hate it. Why? Because I want to be perfect. And that is never going to happen. I keep telling myself. It's never going to happen. One of the things that I love is, I think it's out of the Constitution, a more perfect union. I love that phrase because it's the idea of being more perfect. Okay, you know, you're just getting more perfect every time you learn from a mistake. I like that. Hardworking and self-starting. I mean, I like to think of myself as a hard worker. Respectful of all people. And he's got in parentheses, no behind the back complaining. How does it make you feel when somebody complains about you behind your back? Is that a good feeling? I'll tell you, I hate it. It makes me really mad. And I get back to thinking about the courage spectrum and how I'm going to respond. Am I going to be courageous, or am I going to respond in kind? And then the last one, and I like this one too because I think it fits DOT. I think DOT really fits in this category. Frugal. Frugal. I think DOT tends to be, we are very careful with our money, try to be careful with it. Frugal and unpretentious. You know, we've all got stuff to learn from each other. So anyway, I just thought I'd share those values with you because I have them taped on my wall and I think about them all the time. I read them, try to remind myself, are you living up to this? Are you falling down on the job? So, any other questions or contributions or thoughts? Thank you guys. Appreciate it.